The Unseen Paranormal Podcast presents Paranormal Encounters, stories of the seen and unseen. Our first story comes from Reddit user DJ Stone 1991, a middle of the road motel, as narrated by Brendan Hall of the Music City 911 podcast.
As some of you may know, I'm an armed, uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Knight's Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel, as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously two separate motels, but the Knight's Inn bought both and merged both properties into one. During nearly 20 years of running between both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just happens to be within walking distance from the county jail. So when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way to this motel over the years. Murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on property during the overnight hours, and the three events during three separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first was on my fourth shift. The first few went very slow and boring, but no one had told the staff of the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to last week of operation, I was there helping the on-duty auditor prepare the morning breakfast bar, and the kitchen was in part of the build where a long shut-down restaurant once was. The auditor was preparing waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to a service access stairwell that was padlocked from the inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The scream from the auditor was chilling as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less upstanding guests they'd rented rooms to, I began down the stairs to find the doors were still secured. No one could have entered through. I then stuck my finger in the puddle of soda thinking maybe it got overheated or something causing them to burst. But no, it was slightly cool. The auditor was still there shaking, holding a small kitchen knife trying to calm down, and then we both heard a loud little girl giggle, but it sounded unusual. Needless to say, we both bolted from the kitchen back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me no one checked in tonight that had kids. The following week, and the last week of the location being open before remodel, I was doing standard grounds patrolling, making sure no doors were unsecured or there was no one fighting. Just about the time I finished, I get a call from the front desk, calling a Code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the stairs in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young black woman and her daughter. Just the cutest little 3-year-old. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself. That after nearly an hour in their room, he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room and at his wife and kid. The wife said that he hates weapons and wouldn't have had one, so I began searching the grounds for the man and found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard area. He had the knife in his hand and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw blood. Then I noticed he was bleeding. I ordered him to drop the knife as he slowly started walking towards me. I repeated a second time. Then, on the third order, I drew my weapon and ordered him to stop and to think about his kid. Right as I did that, 3 local officers sprang in from behind me, 2 of them with their tasers drawn. I heard the deputy order the same thing, and then he deployed his taser. I heard him say, "Taser, taser, taser." The local officers took the man in custody and was having me fill out a statement when I overheard 2 of the deputies saying, "Want to know what's odd? The room they're in had a suspicious death a few days ago, but detectives say it was drug-induced suicide." The other deputy replied, "What are the odds this guy goes nuts?" Personally, I was thinking that it is a little bit odd that a man commits suicide, and come to find out he cut his arms till he bled out. And then a week later, another man loses his mind, cuts himself up, and is unresponsive the whole time he was being spoken to. The most damning paranormal event, in my opinion, was the first week it was closed for a remodel. I was walking around the inside, another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that we sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was really haunted. He reluctantly agreed. Using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night I thought I'd overpaid for, we sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes, nothing came through, and we joked that the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it, but come to find out my flashlight had died. So while sitting at the table in a nearly pitch black room, I pulled my taser out of the holster so I could use the light on it. Instantly, the spirit box app said, "Yellow, gun," in the same voice. Now mind you that me and this other officer had the same level of training and were fully certified through the city, but his response was, "The fuck does it mean, yellow gun?" I then proceeded to place my taser on the table and turn its light on. I've never heard so many F-bombs as he stormed out of the room. The final incident I'm still unsure of, but the suspect yelled, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." 4 weeks after the motel closed, I was working a city patrol when the on-duty officer called for priority backup from all available officers on duty. "Sam 262, tonight's in. What's the situation?" The officer responded, 4 to 6 persons had made entry into the back of the building and was barricading themselves in a room. I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m. and met with the on-duty site officer. As we were talking and the third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within minutes, several deputies arrived in active shooter vests and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway, and luckily no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the 3 of us were. A supervisor for the deputies ordered the 4 of them to watch the hallway as the rest took position around the building. We asked what we needed to do, and he replied, to block the entrances to the property so no one comes in that isn't an officer. So basically, we were to keep out any type of impending reporters. SWAT arrived and the deputies pulled back, and SWAT took their position. The whole time the suspect saw the activity from the window and holes in the door. A lieutenant with SWAT and a public relations officer came over to me and the other guys on my staff, and while asking us what happened before the deputies responded, we all heard from a broken out window, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." Around 5 a.m., the SWAT armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we heard 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching the windows and doorway. And just as we heard the thumps and saw the smoke, 5 of the suspects were being carried out, and the 6th was being rushed out on a straight board to an ambulance. Come to find out, the man with a pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital, so I wonder if he joined the other ghosts in the motel.
So what do you think? Do you think he joined the other spirits? Our next story comes from Reddit user Animated Major, narrated by Rob from the Psyche-Delic podcast.
So this is a short, cheeky situation that happened to my friends and I in the middle of the summer in Denver around about 2008. We were bored and sitting around telling stories about the random things that we have done in life, and my time working as a locator for a paranormal hunting group came up. Basically, I was the one who would look for potential haunts, and I would contact the owner of whatever property they were going to hunt, and I would arrange the whole thing permission-wise. The group had a lawyer and insurance that handled the waivers and such. I just got them all in touch with each other to make sure everything was above board and legal, and that the owner wasn't held liable if one of my idiot hunters went screaming into a hole on the property in the middle of the night. Well, that interested a friend of mine who at the time was a skeptic of the paranormal. One of my roommates mentioned our basement was haunted, a recurring theme in my life, I know. The skeptic said we should do an investigation, which translated into there being 6 of us in the basement, sitting in a semicircle with some equipment, asking questions. Most of the people don't matter, save Rob, my best friend, and Goldie, our skeptic friend. Goldie didn't believe in the paranormal and was adamant that all those people are con artists. I guess that included me too, but no worries, I don't take things personally. The basement was an unfinished large room with a metal pole in the middle we were sitting in front of, and I pulled out a couple of things I still had left over when the paranormal hunting group broke up. I keep saying hunting and not investigating because these guys were idiots and they didn't try to debunk or gather any evidence, so much as they just ran around the property acting like assholes. I won't mention their names now or the group name because I'm not a petty person. The equipment that was most important to this situation was the thermometer and the recorder. When we started, I gave Goldie the thermometer and Rob was recorder guy. Rob had done investigations with me a couple times in the past, just the 2 of us, and he knew to call out shuffling or whispering conversation to mark it on the audio. He was also my sound guy in general. Anytime I got evidence, he was the one that found it for me, so the callouts were to help him sort out the sounds of playbacks. So we sat, and Goldie commented how warm the basement was. It was a hot day, and there was no AC venting into the basement. The thermometer said it was in the low 80s. So we sat there for a while asking questions and goofing around in the dark. No one was taking this seriously. After some time, I realized half my body was very cold. Goldie commented almost immediately after that it felt freezing in the room now. She shined a light on the thermometer and it was down to 44 degrees Fahrenheit. We were staring at the readout silently when Rob suddenly yelped and jumped up, then off up the stairs. We followed after into the warm upper level and Rob was pacing around all hyper and freaked out. This guy was a rock and here he was babbling like a scared child. Once I calmed him down, he told me what had happened. As we were looking at the temperature, he heard a whisper in his ear and felt a shocking cold sensation on his crotch. I'm not one to be interested in that kind of experience with the dead, but he freaked out and took off. We didn't have any evidence except his recounting of that uncomfortable situation until we reviewed the audio. There, right between me commenting about how the temperature had dropped 40 degrees and Rob jumping out of his seat, a clear female voice can be heard saying, "I'm so low." Goldie freaked out since she was the only woman in the room at the time, and this voice was right next to the mic while she was at least 8 feet away next to me. These days, Goldie is much more open to the idea of ghosts and spirits. And that's the story of the lonely ghost, or the time Rob got groped by the undead.
What would you do if you were groped by a spirit? How would that make you feel? Our next story comes from Reddit user DJ Stone 1991. I've been working armed security for nearly a decade now, but I still remember working unarmed when I started out in my early 20s. I worked my way to a trusted position with my agency, where at 20 years old, I was assigned to the school. At the time, only senior, more experienced officers were permitted to work there at all, but I was given the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shifts Monday nights through Saturday mornings. A little story on the school. It was opened in the early 1870s and was where the burdened children of the state were sent to live and learn. But many were put to work there as laborers, working fields, or manufacturing items. Because of the number of ailments, accidents, and health conditions, a large number of children and staff passed while there. So in the early 1880s, a small cemetery was created to bury the dead. Growing up, I was told lots of ghost stories about the building, including ghosts walking through the buildings and the haunted service tunnels below the school that connect to the old train depot. But I never really believed it. Fast forward to my 3rd month posted there, 2 nights before my 21st birthday, and a full week before students returned for the fall semester. I had my first encounter in the gym. While checking the boys' locker room, a solid black figure ran past the showers. I rushed to find the intruder, not knowing what I would have done if I would have found it, as I was completely unarmed except for a flashlight. After clearing the building twice and checking all the doors multiple times, I just looked at it as my imagination. The night of my birthday is when everything got much weirder. The shift change went as normal and everything was fine up until my 2:30 a.m. property and building checks. When I went to the carriage house's top floor, where the school stores all the spare desks and equipment, it appeared that a person was standing in the back corner near the old stairs. I shouted at the figure and began to charge toward him. In a frenzy, I hurried to cut him off at the first floor door, but when I got to the door, it was still locked with the interior bolt. I searched the first floor when I found the doors to the service tunnels open. On my first day, I was told not to enter the tunnels alone, as they expand into a labyrinth for miles. I felt as if I'd walked for hours through the tunnels, but only after a few minutes I hear a soft voice, almost like a kid's voice. "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." The next thing I knew, my very angry supervisor, the school's maintenance director, and 2 police officers were shaking me by the shoulders. My supervisor then informed me I missed my 3 a.m. check-in and was sitting in a corner of the tunnels in the dark for over 3 hours. We all left the tunnels and the carriage house to see the sun was beginning to rise. Later that day, my boss reassigned me to a different location. I don't fully know what I saw or what was in those buildings, but it still gives me chills. I'll never forget the voice that I heard before I blacked out. "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." Do you think he experienced loss of time because of a spirit? Maybe it was all in his head. Our next story comes from Reddit user Animated Major, narrated by Tina Marie of the Psyche-Delic podcast.
The house itself wasn't creepy. It was a half-trailer connected to a large wooden building. The trailer section had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom connected to the larger building by a short, thin hallway that contained a washer and a dryer, which we called the washroom. The main part of the house had a living room with an attached dining room, kitchen, and the master bedroom. All in all, it was a great size for my family of 5. My brother, sister, mother, father, and me. The best part about it was that we had the largest amount of waterfront property along our little neighborhood. Everything about my life was going great at the time because I was 5 and my biggest concern in life was how I was going to get the Ghostbusters Firehouse playset. The only thing that was really a problem was that I was afraid of the dark. At that time, I had no reason to be. The only weird thing I'd ever experienced was in broad daylight. Things had yet to go bump in the night for me. But my fear often had me sleeping in the beds of others. I shared a room with my brother in the trailer. My sister had her own room. Sometimes I'd get scared and try to sleep in my brother's bed. He didn't really like that idea, so he would make me sleep at the foot of the bed, like the dogs do. I wasn't comfortable doing that regularly, so I would often choose to go to my parents' bedroom and sleep with them. But making that trip meant going through the washroom, where the dryer was. Something about that short little hallway at night sent shivers down my spine. I hated if it was ever left open. It would scare me. I found myself running through that hallway, holding my pillow like a shield. I never slept without my pillow, which was nothing special except I had a pillowcase that had a cat wearing red sneakers on it. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, I decided that I needed to sleep in the same bed as someone to make the scare go away. I tried my brother, but he wouldn't wake up, and I knew I wasn't supposed to sleep in his bed without permission, so I decided it was going to be the parents' room that night. I grabbed my pillow and I softly padded through the trailer, past the bathroom, and into the washroom hallway. I remember that hallway that night with perfect visual clarity. There was a fish tank in the living room, with a light that cast a dim glow into the washroom. I remember clearly the pile of clothing to my right, stuff that needed to be washed, and the washer and dryer to my left. I remember the dryer door was open. I hated that it looked like a big, hungry mouth. I hated that the light didn't shine into it from the fish tank. I steeled myself and I charged forward, hugging my pillow tightly. I rushed past the washer and then the dryer, and just as I was excited that I had made it, something grabbed me. I could feel cold, long fingers wrap around my torso. In my mind, I've always imagined them to be long, knobby hands with sharp fingers. I cried out and dropped my pillow, and I was tugged backwards. I remember the feeling of the opening of the dryer scraping against my arms and head, and I felt myself bend at the waist painfully. I heard the dryer door slam shut after I was pulled into it, and then I jerked awake. I was in my bed, alone, in the dark, and scared to death. I was too scared to leave the bedroom again, so I just cried into my blankets and fell back asleep. That would have been it. Just a bad nightmare that I never would even think to be anything else. I wouldn't even post something like that here if it hadn't been for what happened when my mom woke me up in the morning. She brought my pillow into my room with her and said she found it in front of the dryer. It's been 23 years since then. I don't remember a whole lot about our time in that house, and I don't remember how I reacted when my mom gave me my pillow. But my mom remembers. I was talking to her about this, wondering if what I remembered about that house was accurate. I asked her if I had ever told her about the dryer grabbing me. She told me about the day she found my pillow in front of it. When she gave it back to me, I started crying. I told her about my dream. I'd promised to never go to her room to sleep again, and she vividly remembers this because I never did sleep in her room again. I can't tell you if this actually happened, or if it was a crazy dream where I sleepwalked and dropped my pillow in the washroom and then went back to bed. I'm still very picky about sleeping with my pillow, and every dryer I've ever purchased has to have a light in it. It's not a conscious choice. It's just something I realized to look out for in a dryer these days.
Maybe just a bad dream. Maybe not. Our next story comes from Reddit user DJ Stone 1991, narrated by Alan Sircy of the Southern Ghost Stories podcast.
I'm an armed private security officer in Colorado Springs, and over the last few months, my company has been doing a specific property check within a community we already patrol at night. 1315 Wood Avenue has had an interesting past. It's better known as the Burns Mansion on the Old Millionaire's Row in the Old North End. James Ferguson Burns, who died in Colorado Springs, he was a very wealthy man across his numerous endeavors in the greater Colorado area. His death was suspected in the mansion on September 23, 1917, as well as a few servants who also died on the property. Earlier this year, 2020, acting as an 8-unit apartment building, a suspicious death occurred on the property, prompting the city to step in. After conducting the police and forensic investigation of the death, the city immediately shut down the entire property and it was renovated and brought up to modern code. But these events displaced all the tenants and families with no warning. It was said that James Burns dabbled in spiritualism via spirit boards and mediums. On the night of September 21st, I was the patrol officer on duty for that area. Now, our normal procedure for the property is to check around the enormous house to ensure the primary structure is secured and that area homeless have not made entry. After dismounting from my cruiser, I began to check the street side of the property, starting with the front cellar access. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I started towards the grand patio that nearly wraps around the whole front side. At the far end, I noticed the porch swing was slightly swaying side to side, not back and forth, but I thought nothing of it, as his home was an old location. I began around the rear of the mansion, and as soon as I came around the gate, I heard an older man's voice faintly coming from the servants' quarters on the second floor of the carriage house. So instead of checking the rear of the mansion, I followed standard operating procedure and went straight to investigate the sounds. At the entrance to the carriage house, where all the discarded personal items of the tenants were displaced, there was a path to the stairs, and it was a pretty uneasy trek. Old furniture, toys, photos, and other items covered most of the ground. While trying not to fall, I heard the older voice again, but it was still faint and very hard to hear. Knowing that the possibility of an intruder was nearly 100%, I drew my sidearm and clasped my light between my fingers. I announced myself in the loudest commanding tone I could imagine, leaving no doubt that I wouldn't be heard. After the second attempt of commanding them to identify themselves failed, I moved up the stairs. The second level is in a state of decay, and it looks like the setting for a horror movie. After clearing the small 4-room area, I had only a small walk-in closet left, thinking surely this is where the subject is. I kept my sidearm level as I whipped the door open with my opposite hand. Nothing occupied this space. I holstered, thinking maybe I just had too much or too little caffeine, or maybe a raccoon was being playful. I exited the carriage house to resume checking the mansion door barricades to ensure they were either locked or undamaged. While at the parlor door, I saw a shadow coming from underneath the door. Aggravated, I ran to the parlor window, flashing the light into the entire room to see who in the hell was walking around inside. Again, nothing. No sign that anything had been inside since earlier that day. I was really pissed that so many weird things were happening. I checked the rest of the doors, which were all locked. I headed back to the cruiser and lit a cigarette. As I took a long drag, the inside lights flickered and went off briefly. I looked up to the second floor and saw a discolored face peering out before the lights sprang back on. I flicked my cigarette butt and said to myself, yeah, screw that. I jumped into the car and called out 1315, code 4, clearing.
If you ever find yourself in Colorado Springs, you might want to steer clear of Burns Mansion, or you might just have a run-in yourself with James Ferguson Burns. For our next story, we have It Crawled Into Bed With Me from Reddit user Ugly Lumberco. So when I was about 17, my family had just been back to Canada from living in the U.S. It was a bit sudden, and being a family of 6, it was a little bit of a scramble to find a place to house all of us before the snow hit. So my mom and dad decided to live in an old house that my grandpa had on his property just for the duration of the oncoming winter. The house was my great uncle's, and my grandpa skid it from his brother's property to his place. My grandpa has 2 quarter sections, and this house is tucked way back away from his main house. So the powers ran from the main house, and with it being so far away, there is no running water. This house is old, so to add to the no running water, only a wood stove. Just to give you an idea of what we were living in. Me being a 17-year-old, often stayed in town, and didn't stay there very often, not just because it was a pain with the no water and heat, but because shit was creepy. I specifically remember the first time it happened. I was in my bed. I was the only one who would stay downstairs. With the wood stove, everyone wanted to sleep upstairs since it was warmer. I was just starting to fall asleep, and I started to feel the room get really heavy. I remember the feeling of not being alone. The doorway didn't have a door on it, and I could feel it standing there. I remember having a feeling of total fear rush over me, and I was frozen to my core with it. Then it moved closer, and I felt the bed move, and someone crawled right up beside me in a sneaky, slow, sloth-moving type of way. I specifically remember wanting to vomit in fear. Then, I felt it, the feeling of an unshaven face rubbing against mine. I lost my damn mind. I scrambled out of bed, holding my blanket, and ran up the stairs to my parents' room. I slept on the floor, on my dad's side of the bed. The next morning, my mom was wondering why her 17-year-old was curled up at the foot of their bed, and I told her what happened. Later that morning, we walked over to my grandpa's house to have breakfast and go chat. My mom brought up my wild story. My grandpa and grandma silently listened, and as my mom was laughing at the last bit of the story, my grandparents got really serious and turned to each other. Apparently this has been an issue in this old house, and they didn't want to tell us, hoping if we didn't acknowledge it, then it wouldn't bother us. I can honestly say I didn't feel angry or upset. I guess it just wanted to cuddle. What would you do if something crawled into bed with you? Would you cuddle with it? Our last story, my first and last time in Lee Woods, comes from Reddit user Prod by UnhinHXD. My name is Luke, and I am now 20 years old. The story happened 3 years ago. This experience still gives me chills to this day. In May 2017, I found myself going out a lot more on my mountain bike. I was getting bored of cruising around the streets, so I wanted to go for a trail ride. After some research into a few different areas, Lee Woods seemed to be my best bet. Living only a couple miles away, it was a nice bike ride. When I arrived, it looked very peaceful, and I was almost in a dreamlike state. For a woodland area in England, let alone Bristol, it was amazing. On going into the woods, I remember seeing different colors at the start of each trail, signifying difficulty for bikers and length for walkers. So I decided to go down a few of the colored trails to see how they were. Finding it exciting, I decided to go down a harder trail, and now here's where it starts to get weird. I began having this weird sort of vision, looking around as if I'm being swallowed by the woods. Everything felt like it was getting bigger and further away. I brushed it off, but it turns out I actually lost track of time. I got lost on the trail. I then came to a strange opening. I could go left in the direction of the way out, or right to go deeper into the woods. I decided to go deeper into the woods. I came to a weird little trail that just had dodgy written all over it. I went against my gut feeling and went down that trail. I came to a point where the trail continued, but it was getting dangerous. I went against my gut feeling and went down that trail. I came to a point where the trail continued, but was getting dangerous. I continued down it for a few minutes before turning back. I don't know why, but I just stood still staring down the trail. I felt like I was being watched from all angles, even though it would be impossible to have that many eyes surrounding me in that area. I got nervous and began walking back up the hill as I was too tired to ride at this point. Upon getting back to the spot where I originally went to the trail, that weird loss of time happened. It felt as if the whole path had stretched by half a mile, as if the woods were moving. I began walking up the path, feeling that same eerie sensation of being watched as I did before. This time it felt a little more sinister. It felt as if something was about to happen. I hadn't seen a single person at this point in time since I'd went down that trail. In front of me was a long path, a slight steep hill to my left, a small creek to my right, maybe 4 feet deep, 4 feet wide, bushes on the other side of the creek with the odd tree every now and then. About a quarter of the way up the steep path, I hear a woman crying behind a tree. I started slowing down my walking pace to try and get a good look, but the whole time I'm thinking to myself, why would someone jump across the creek to cry behind a tree? Many people go to Lee Woods to commit suicide, so I was hoping to maybe help this person. As I edged closer to the river to see if the person's okay, there's no one there, and the crying stopped. A bit weirded out, I just slowly turned away and started walking faster. I had this sudden shiver. Only a couple meters away from where I heard the crying before, it started again, but this time it was opposite me across the creek. I didn't bother looking. I started to go into a bit of a jog
and as I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling as if they or it was following me. Upon hearing this, I sped up, and the crying became more and more hysterical. I thought to myself, "F this, I'm gone." As the adrenaline was rushing through me, I went to hop on my bike and almost came to a sudden stop. My back tire was completely flat, so I had no other choice but to sprint with my bike and pray for the best. With the crying person still close to me and keeping up, I'm running faster and faster, praying I just get off this path. I had the feeling of wanting to cry because I couldn't actually do anything to help the situation or get out of it faster. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the car park. The crying had stopped following me and started moving back down to where I first heard it. I sprinted out into the car park. I must have been as white as a sheet and hysterical with my breathing and wheezing as multiple people in the car park turned to look at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign out of the car park and ran towards it. I noticed my bike to be moving a lot smoother on approaching the car park exit. I couldn't believe my bike tire had suddenly regained all of its air. It was solid again. I jumped on my bike and got away from Lee Woods as fast as I could, and I have never gone back.
That last story is a little creepy. Well, that comes to the end of our paranormal encounters. I want to say thank you to my guest narrators, Tina and Rob from the Psyche-Delic podcast, Alan Sircy from Southern Ghost Stories podcast, and Brandon Hall from Music City 911 podcast. They all have amazing shows. Please go check them out and give them some love. All of our stories were used by permission. I want to give a big thank you to all the Reddit users who allowed me to use their stories. Happy Halloween, everybody. This is Eric saying, stay safe out there.